Hello friends, welcome to the fourth video in this mini-series called Nietzsche November, where each week we're looking at a major work from Friedrich Nietzsche and talking about the core concepts, the themes, my interpretations, and really having that back and forth with you guys as well in the comment section below. And I'm having a lot of fun with the series so far. We got this video and then one more. So without further ado, let's dig into Beyond Good and Evil. Now, as always, a couple intro points. One, a little bit of a disclaimer. I do not come from academia. I do not have some philosophical background. So this video is not aimed at being a totally deep analysis into the work itself. So if you're looking for that, there's plenty of great videos out there that do a even deeper dive into the depth of this work and all those little intricacies. In this video, I'm just going to give my interpretation as well as go over some of those broad themes, concepts, and quotes as well. The other thing to note is this is my second time reading this book, and if it's that way for you guys as well, you'll probably share the sentiment that I'm about to say, and that is context matters. Holy cow, is this book dense intellectually. It is quite confusing, honestly, even with context, but it is highly important that you read a lot of these prerequisite works before getting into this. And what I mean is you need to understand Hume, David Hume, and his rejection of causality. You need to understand Kant and his ideas, his critique of reason. You need to understand Socrates and Plato and his conception of the good. You need to understand Schopenhauer and his will. You need to understand Descartes and his skepticism and doubt and rationalism overall, including Spinoza. It sounds like you got to read a lot before you can get to this work, but honestly, it's the truth. It's important. I read this early on into my philosophical journey and did not understand that much, as my notes would show you. But then coming back to it this year, having read all of those philosophers I just listed and a whole lot more, I'm able to come to this work with a much greater chance at understanding and grasping all these ideas, connecting things, and I'm able to kind of piece the puzzle together, so to speak, a whole lot better. So it's very important to just put that out front, that a lot of this is not going to make sense, at least not to the nth degree, or at least not to the extent that it could if you read those other philosophical thinkers and their works. Another important note to make is that Beyond Good and Evil precedes the work we covered last week on the genealogy of morals. That actually came out after this book, and the reason I covered it last week is because a lot of these ideas are kind of explored a lot deeper in that work, and so I think it's a little bit easier to read on the genealogy of morals and then get to Beyond Good and Evil and start to see the connections and where Nietzsche was going on with those ideas. So that's important to note. Another thing is that I'll be reading and referencing the R.J. Hollingsdale translation, so the Penguin edition. So any page numbers, quotes, translation, all that's going to be coming from this book, and I will link this exact translation and a PDF copy in the description below, so you can grab the book or read it for free as well. And the last thing to note is the book structure. So this is broken up into 9 different parts, chapters, whatever you want to call them. And it's funny. I actually filmed this video. I spoke and filmed for like 3 hours covering this book. And I made the mistake of trying to go through part by part. And then by the time I got to the end of filming the video, I realized it wasn't going to make that much sense. It was and wasn't. It was just a little bit all over the place. And the book itself isn't that way, but at least the way I was trying to explain the ideas and connect them all together at the end, it was too much. I trashed the video, and now I'm filming this one. And we're going to go about it a little bit differently. There's a couple core concepts that Nietzsche talks about. He talks about antithetical values, truth, morality, will to power. You see a little bit of eternal recurrence in there. You also see order of rank, higher men, future philosophers. So what we're going to do is break it down into those. I believe I have it broken into 5 kind of main topics, and then we're going to explore those each at a time, summarize them, and we can kind of put a bow on it at the end. So without further ado, let's dig into Beyond Good and Evil. Now, the first thing we're going to discuss is truth and antithetical values, because that is an essential part within this book and essential to Nietzsche's criticism. It kind of is the foundation, and you see it interwoven into all the other topics he digs into later in the book. So what does he mean by antithetical values? These are opposing values, so truth and falsity. wrong and right, good versus evil, appearance versus reality. All these different valuations, basically, these value judgments that are being put forth, Nietzsche thinks that they aren't as objective as we perceive them to be. Or perhaps that's not the best way to put it. To be honest, this was one of the harder uh, ideas for me to conceptualize, was questioning truth as being valuable, questioning knowledge as being useful, and tying in that truth is good. All of this is kind of bred into us at a young age. We are taught the scientific method, we're taught cause equals effect and truth and falsity. And it's hard to kind of separate our minds from these prejudices that are born into us as children in school. But this is why I reference it's important to read David Hume, is his rejection of causality, or not exactly a rejection per se, but just that we can't know it's for certain. We can't always know that A is going to equal B. We can have custom or habit, as he describes it, and we can have a extremely high probability that A is going to equal B, but we can't know it for certain. And also when it comes to Nietzsche's particular criticism, is we can't know or always assume that truth is always better for us or good for us or useful for us than falsity. So this already kind of sends your mind for a whirl, kind of shatters your worldview, pulls the rug out beneath you, and now you're kind of on skates, so to speak. And a lot of Nietzsche's perspective is that truth is very much an interpretation. What is good, what is righteous, what is pious, is very much an interpretation rather than some objective fact. And we'll get into that particularly with rationalism in a moment. But just to linger on this for a second, we see on page 61, section 30, he says, "What serves the higher type of man as food or refreshment must to a very different and inferior type be almost poison. The virtues of the common man would perhaps indicate vice and weakness in a philosopher." Another good example would be to reference what we discussed in On the Genealogy of Morals when you think of birds of prey, so think like eagles or vultures or something, and the lamb. So from the birds of prey perspective, the lamb is good, it's tasteful, it's nutritious for them to kill the lamb, it's good for them to kill the lamb. But for the lamb, the birds of prey are evil. That is wrong to commit murder, to kill us, and all of that. So you can see how there is no universal truth. There is no universal good. It is very much a matter of perspective or your own subjectivity. And then we see Nietzsche turn his criticism towards rationalism, and specifically Descartes and Spinoza. And this is because we perceive reason as and our capacity for reason as these rational beings, right? That's how we're different from the apes or the brutes, is that we are capable of rational thinking, of thinking kind of separate from our animal instincts, or so we suppose. So reason is supposed to be objective, but as Nietzsche well points out, and this is where he kind of starts to psychologize a little bit, is our instincts very much influence our reason. Our passions, our emotions very much influence what we rationalize later on. So he also critiques Descartes specifically and says how he kind of already goes in with a prejudice from the get-go. His famous "I think, therefore I am" comes in with a prejudice and assumption of a thinking being, of a subjectivity. So he says this on page 46, "Let the people believe that knowledge is total knowledge, but the philosopher must say to himself, when I analyze the event expressed in the sentence 'I think,' I acquire a series of rash assertions which are difficult, perhaps impossible to prove. For example, that it is I who think, that it has to be something at all which thinks, that thinking is an activity and operation on part of an entity thought of as a cause, that an I exists. Finally, that what is designated by thinking has already been determined, that I know what thinking is." And while you're chewing on that quote, later on page 114, he criticizes Socrates and points out that even Socrates acknowledges his own irony or the contradiction within his thought. So he says here that one must follow the instincts but persuade reason to aid them with good arguments. This was the actual falsity of that great ironist. Later on he says he had seen through the irrational aspect of moral judgment. So essentially Nietzsche points out that we're often using reason to try and justify what our passions or instincts desire. So we have these kind of, and it's important to note that Nietzsche doesn't fully negate or reject free will, but he is very much a determinist in the idea that much of our will to power, much of how and why we act in the first place is driven through our instincts. That he's coming through a time where Darwinism has arisen, and we're starting to really understand where humans evolved from. And Nietzsche points out that, and I think he says in the other book, he calls reason and rationality our weakest instrument, our weakest ability as human beings. And so he views reason as trying to justify the passions rather than being the controller. So we think we're in control more than we are is probably an easier way to put it. In reality, we use reason to justify what our passions desire in the first place. And how this connects to reason is, think about the consequences or the implications of a stronger belief in free will. Because if we have free will, as Nietzsche points out in section 32, then the shift from valuing, he believes that in pre-moral sentiment we would put value or judgment upon the consequences of an action. But if we have free will, and this is the shift that he believes takes place, once we have more emphasis on free will, we start to value intention. We start to think about someone's intentions and believe that they chose to act out, or they chose to act morally immoral, or they chose to act in an evil way, and therefore we kind of judge that person's character. We can judge it as immoral. Without repeating myself, Nietzsche, of course, denies this. He calls that more of a sign or symptom, but not the actual cause of why we act in the first place. So again, shifting the emphasis from our rational ability, putting less emphasis there, putting more of a focus on the more innate influences within our body, the instincts, the natural passions, desires, emotions that drive us to act a certain way, rather than our rational capacity actively choosing to act a certain way. So kind of less intentionality maybe is a way to think about it. And he says on page 65, it is no more than a moral prejudice that truth is worth more than appearance. It is even the worst proved assumption that exists. And why he says that is because later on in section 39, he kind of describes how psychopathy is really at the root of humanity, or at least that was the origin of it. Humanity is not as far from psychopathy as we think we are. So if we think how human beings really originated, is we originated from a point or a bunch of psychopaths, essentially. Like, who led these tribes? Who led these nomads? Well, it was the barbaric, it was the strong that were able to survive. And it was those strong, barbaric psychopaths that, are our ancestors. And so Nietzsche points out that as much as we've kind of evolved from that, we still have a lot of that at our foundation. And his justification for that is that because there are some people, essentially, it's wrong to assume that if someone acts evil, that they feel bad for being evil. So I'll just read off this quote. It'll probably be a better way than me describing it. Page 68, he says, "But there can be no doubt that for the discovery of certain parts of truth, the wicked and unhappy are in a more favorable position and are more likely to succeed. Not to speak of the wicked who are happy, a species about whom the moralists are silent." So essentially, they're wicked people. They're people that act evil, that is useful for them, that are in a favorable position. That doesn't make them, they're technically immoral to the moralists, but they aren't unhappy. They don't feel bad because they don't have that moral system or belief system in their head. So the idea that morality is some part that's intrinsic to nature, that it is objective, is kind of disproven by that on face value. So to round out this little subsection on antithetical values, Nietzsche of course rejects them. He thinks truth is very much a matter of perspective or position. It's very much subjective, and that as much as we put a lot of value into rationality, the idea that reason could lead us to some crystal palace, as Dostoevsky describes it, or some universal good is quite naive, and it's ignorant to the fact that we have these passions, desires, these instincts that are very much influencing us. Now let's discuss morality and a little bit of religion as well, as they get tied together. Starting off in section 187, he starts attacking Kant, as he loves to do throughout this work, and specifically his categorical imperative. And he talks about how a lot of these philosophers are just coming up with these imperatives or these kind of laws that they conceive that are actually quite arbitrary, and that they conceive of these laws to try and justify how they act. So he says here, mocking Kant, what is worthy of respect in me is that I know how to obey, and things ought to be no different with you. And he calls moralities a sign language of the emotions. So again, it's essentially us trying to justify what our emotions, our passions desire, and then try and attach some natural law to it that is supposedly objective. Moving on in 188, he makes a pretty interesting argument here, makes an interesting case that we as humans over time have developed this second nature, or this kind of natural inclination for obedience. So he points out that morality is, of course, opposed to absolute freedom, the kind of like no laws. But because we have this desire for obedience, this desire to obey and to have duty, we establish these arbitrary laws for ourselves. And he kind of describes that for much of society, it actually is very beneficial and leads to growth and the preservation of life. So on page 112, he calls this nature's imperative, kind of mocking Kant's categorical imperative, where he says, thou shalt obey someone and for a long time. Otherwise, thou shalt perish and lose all respect for thyself. So he really says that by having these arbitrary laws for ourselves, by not living in a state of somewhat anarchy or chaos with no laws or perception of duty or morality, that by having this natural imperative, we are able to kind of narrow our perspective and follow tasks and, I guess, progress mankind a lot better. Tying this back to on the genealogy of morals too, we also see Nietzsche kind of start to build a little bit throughout the work of this concept of ressentiment or resentment, which is essentially the slave morality, or the weaker in society, the timid, the cowardly, because they are unable to assert themselves to overpower the strong-willed, because they're unable to overpower the nobility. What they do is essentially deem them as evil. It's their only way to kind of gain power, to gain control, is by trying to establish equality or put immorality or impiety upon the physically stronger, the stronger willed, and all of that. It's a way of kind of compensating for their inadequacy, so to speak. And this connects to section 219, where he talks about how moral judgment and condemnation comes from this spirit of revenge. These people are vengeful, and that they require the belief of God, because that will at least establish equality, because all children are equal in the eyes of God. So, to read off a quote here on page 149, he says, they struggle for the equality of all before God, and it is virtually for that purpose that they need the belief in God. Now, in section 228 and other sections of the book as well, we see Nietzsche really attack some of these English philosophers that have this perception that rationality, the good, all of this will lead us to, as he quotes, general utility, or the happiness of the greatest number. And a lot of this comes with the prejudice we talked about a little bit earlier, that if we could just teach everyone reason, if everyone acted from a place of reason and rationality, then we could achieve a higher society. Everyone would be happy, there would be harmony, there would be peace. If people would just act right, if they just knew, if they just had the knowledge to act good, they would be good. Of course, Nietzsche believes this comes with a lot of assertions, a lot of assumptions. And again, Dostoevsky also talked about this with his notes from Underground. The Underground Man is very much against that idea. He wants to act bad. He wants to stick his tongue out at the Crystal Palace. And also Nietzsche's problem with this, and his problem with democracy, is that it seeks to kind of treat everyone as equal. But as we'll get to with the will to power, Nietzsche does not believe that all wills are equal. He thinks that some people are stronger than others. Some people are more willed. Some people are more capable of asserting themselves. They have more of an aggressive nature. Others might be impoverished. Others might be weaker, more timid, cowardly. And that we shouldn't treat everyone on the same playing field, that there should be this kind of order of rank. And that by trying to squish everyone, let's say, into the same mean, the same average, it really just creates a society of mediocrity. And we'll get to this again later, but he thinks that this basically sublimates the higher man and diminishes him and turns him into a herd animal. And in connection with that, in 225, we see Nietzsche vehemently attack pity. And the reason for that is because he believes that this push to abolish suffering will only lead to a weaker man. He believes that we really need the suffering and we desire suffering because it forms us. It makes us stronger human beings and allows the higher man to kind of reach greater heights. So he talks about this on page 155 where he says, quote, "The discipline of suffering, of great suffering, do you not know that it is this discipline alone which has created every elevation of man hitherto?" And part of the suffering ends up getting turned upon oneself, which is what Nietzsche talks about a lot in On the Genealogy of Morals. This is where the bad conscience originates because man is unable to enact himself in the world, is unable to really enact his will to power. He has to kind of reject himself. He has to deny his will. A lot of this is tied into asceticism. Because of that, he turns the cruelty onto himself, and he actually finds enjoyment in that suffering. So he says, page 159, "There's also an abundant, overabundant enjoyment of one's own suffering, of making oneself suffer." So again, it's pretty interesting just to think about that dynamic of cruelty, how we kind of have this innate desire for cruelty, again, coming from the psychopathy or that psychotic nature that we originate out of from being an animal, from being our barbaric origins, and trying to tame man. Nietzsche thinks is a bit of a mistake, trying to tame man. All these different things, whether it's democracy, whether it's the concept of a universal good, morality overall, ascetic ideal, all this is taming man, which Nietzsche worries is, like I said, going to turn him into a mediocre man and not going to elevate society to its highest potential. Another point when it comes to morality is that Nietzsche believes that, at least in part, morality was conceived to justify our suffering. That's where a lot of sin originates from. Why do we suffer? Because we sin. So in section 57 on page 82, he has this interesting kind of metaphor that I think is quite illuminating, where he says the concepts God and sin will one day seem to us of no more importance than a child's toy, and a child's troubles seem to an old man. And perhaps old man will then have need of another toy and other troubles, still enough of a child, an eternal child. So what I believe he's getting at there is that even once we've killed God, as he talks about in the Gay Science, even once God is dead, religion, if we get rid of that, we'll still have to create some new toy, so to speak, some new invention to kind of justify our suffering, give reason to it. But in reality, as we know, nature is irrational. It is quite absurd a lot of times. It does not follow any moral laws. It is neither moral nor immoral. The lion is going to go kill the gazelle. He's not worried about the gazelle's feelings. He's not worried about sin, whether this is right or wrong. He just does. It is this will to power, it's this instinct. And Nietzsche talks about this a little bit too, how the individual is always going to be a threat to the community. In section 201, page 122, he says, "So long as the utility which dominates moral value judgments is solely that which is useful to the herd, so long as the object is solely the preservation of the community, and the immoral is sought precisely and exclusively in that which seems to imperil the existence of the community, so long as that is the case, there can be no morality of love of one's neighbor." Of course, this comes out of the Bible. It's one of the commandments, love thy neighbor. But you can't love thy neighbor because that would be self-interested. You might say, well, that's someone else. You're loving someone else. Yes, but it is your neighbor. And if you're loving them rather than loving the community more universally as a whole, there's still some matter of passion, of subjectivity in there. Is it's your neighbor rather than the universal perspective. So with all that said, let's move on to the philosophers of the future. A lot of this is contained within the section titled We Scholars, where he talks about through science, through reason, through this kind of enlightenment period that has occurred within Western Europe, there's this push for reason, rationality. We've hit that home hard enough. But these scholars are coming up and they're seeing all these faulty systems of these previous philosophers, and they're trying to figure out how can we actually get to the business of it? How can we get to objective truth? They seek to become a mirror, so to speak, is how Nietzsche describes it. They seek to find this disinterested knowledge, so knowledge separate from passions, from subjectivity. They try and seek to become this reflections of forms and events not his own. They really are seeking to, again, try to become this pure will-less subject that Schopenhauer talks about. How can we find truth, eliminate all this nonsense we talked about before that's altering the truth, making it subjective? But Nietzsche says by doing this, you become a, quote, selfless man. And he quotes Leibniz in here as well, and says that he becomes almost nothing, unable to affirm, unable to deny, and it really treats life and nature in this mechanistic way, a very deterministic way. And of course, Nietzsche is not for this. He's very much a fan, an advocate of the passions, the arts, and doesn't believe that life is this kind of dull, mechanistic being, so to speak. So what is Nietzsche's solution? What does he argue should replace these scholars, these kind of older philosophical traditions and ways of looking at things? Well, he believes that these free spirits, these philosophers of the future, should be critics, not skeptics, so that they shouldn't seek to be, in constant doubt, trying to become these objective, quote unquote, disinterested thinkers, but really they should understand and acknowledge their own interests or own passions within the rationality and just be very critical of it. Not try and seek a universal truth, not try and seek the universal good or have such certainty, but be critical, but not let that stop you from making any progress or judgments at all. He says here on page 141, indeed, they confess to taking a pleasure in negating and dissecting to a certain self-possessed cruelty which knows how to wield the knife with certainty and deftness even when the heart bleeds. So even if it's an uncomfortable truth, they still are going to kind of critique and wield that knife with certainty anyway. He says here a little bit further, they will rather be little disposed to believe that truth of all things should be attended by such pleasures. So again, truth is not always tied to some conception of good. It is not always tied to our pleasures. In simple, the truth hurts sometimes. And essentially, he believes that these philosophers of the future, these, quote, actual philosophers, should be commanders and should be lawgivers. They should define their own values. They should, treat knowledge as a means and an instrument and a hammer, not as an end that has previously been done. He says here on page 144, this kind of encapsulates it all a bit. He shall be the greatest who can be the most solitary, the most concealed, the most divergent, the man beyond good and evil, the master of his virtues, the superabundant of will. This shall be called greatness, the ability to be as manifold as whole, as vast as full. And to ask it again, is greatness possible today? So one, we have to acknowledge the fact that these men, these higher men that we'll get to in a moment, these philosophers of the future, they're going to be solitary. They're going to be kind of rejected against society because he talks about earlier in the book that all that is rare is for the rare. So it's, again, they're going to be a small select of these people that are going to be capable of the highest culture, of going to be capable of high art, of independence, of strong-willed, all of that. It's going to be a very small select number of people that are going to be on the highest kind of order of rank. And he questions, is greatness possible today? And that's important because that's a concern you see throughout a lot of Nietzsche's works. You see it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra as well. He believes we should be working towards this Übermensch, this Superman, the Overman, man that is capable of overcoming himself. And Nietzsche's worried that we're not going to get there. He's worried that culture is in such a decadent state that morality, religion, democracy, all of these things are undermining man. They're making him weaker. This abolishment of suffering, pity, all of this is leading to a weaker man. It is leading to mediocrity across the board, and that this seek to make everything kind of average, mean, this egalitarian approach is it's going to crush culture and crush society, and we're never going to be able to reach the heights that mankind as a species could reach. So that's his concern, and that's what he hopes these philosophers of the future can kind of rekindle, is this lofty, independent spirit to be a quote-unquote experimenter and define his own values, create his own values, not try and take these subjective values and put them on everybody, not try and create some universal morality, but be a critic, not a skeptic, and that's what he hopes that these free spirits can do. And that leads us to the will to power, one of Nietzsche's most famous concepts. And I think the best place to start here is on page 44, section 13, where he says, physiologists should think again before postulating the drive to self-preservation as the cardinal drive in an organic being. So that idea of like will to live, will to exist. Back to the quote, he says, a living thing desires above all to vent its strength. Life as such is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent consequences of it. In short, here is everywhere, beware of superfluous teleological principles, such as is the drive to self-preservation. So he's pointing out that trying to argue that all life is this survival instinct. He believes that that's wrong. That's only a consequence. That's kind of a reactionary achievement, to put it that way, that happens. I talked about this in the last video on the genealogy of morals. He believes that trying to or fixating our initial drive as will to exist, will to survive, self-preservation is wrong for this way. And here's a good way to think about it, is that if that's all it is, then we're in this constant state of adapting. Well, what are we adapting to? What are we trying to resist to preserve ourselves? Well, we're resisting an initial force, some resistance. And what Nietzsche believes that original resistance is will to power. That will to power, that the world in nature overall is essentially a bunch of singular competing wills, a bunch of singular competing forces, a bunch of will to powers competing with each other, exploiting, overpowering each other, all of that. We'll get to a better quote to describe it in a moment. But this is contrary to Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's once mentor. Schopenhauer's perspective was that everything is basically under the same one will. Everything has the same will, just in varying gradations within it. So, a rock, myself, you, we all have the same kind of will. Nietzsche does not believe this. He believes that it's kind of like a reductionist view, and that really it's a bunch of singular wills competing. And so, again, that's where the original force comes from. Will to exist, will to preserve ourselves, that would be a reaction to some resistance. So we're focused on a secondary force, a secondary activity. The initial activity, the primary activity driving everything in the world, the primary essence of life and nature is will to power in Nietzsche's eyes. And that leads us to page 194, where he kind of puts it quite simply. Quote, one has to think this matter thoroughly through to the bottom and resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, overpowering of the strange and weaker, suppression, severity, imposition of one's own forms, incorporation, and at the least and mildest exploitation. Now, it's important to again remember, he says these words with much intention. Resist all sentimental weakness, because when you first hear that quote, you think, man, this guy's kind of a jerk, Life is all appropriation. Life is all about overpowering other people, injuring others. That sounds awful. And it does. But one, we first have to take out our sentimental emotions, try and take out our moral prejudices that we enter within. And this is why Nietzsche seems so divisive or hostile to people, is because this kind of is the inverse of what we're taught growing up, right? We're taught golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated, care about others. But Nietzsche points out that that's a nice idea, and that's nice that we can try and push culture towards, let's say, that utopian concept, but nature and reality is not that way. I mean, think about it. We want ourselves to get the raise at work. We don't want the other person, so we're competing with our coworkers so that we can become the boss, that we can get the next raise. We compete with people to buy a house, so we're bidding with other people to buy a home. We're competing with other people to buy whatever it is. We're competing with other people with our business with another person's. In nature, animals are competing for food. They're not worried about morality when it comes to killing each other to survive, to feed their own family. So if you think about it more broadly, if you think about some of the undertones of things that are, let's say, a lot less violent examples, but still have that will to power at a foundational level, we see that, life very much is not just survival of the fittest, survival of like the strongest. And so I think that the initial reaction to be very resistive against that, to kind of reject that idea from Nietzsche. It comes from a good place. It comes from, again, our emotions, our passions, and our sympathy. But again, I think it's important to linger on this idea and realize Nietzsche's not coming at it from as aggressive perspective as it sounds. And it's also important to point out that Nietzsche isn't this ultimate example himself. He's not the Ubermensch. He's not even quite, the perfect example of a higher man, because he himself wasn't read that much in his time. He wasn't part of some high nobility class. He wasn't, rich and powerful. He wasn't any of these things. So, if you take it under the perspective of he's just trying to oppress other people, he's a bad guy, he doesn't have any concern for the poor, it's not that. It's because Nietzsche wouldn't even be included in that. It's that he believes, or he's more focused on the furthering of the species of man, the species of humankind, rather than he's worried about the general welfare of the majority. He's more focused on the elevation of the minority, the few, the strong, the impressive, and he doesn't want to sacrifice that subsect for the happiness of the many. And that leads us to our last little subsection, order of rank and the higher men. So what is Nietzsche's solution? What is he advocating for? He talks about this mostly in part 9, the last section, what is noble? And he's essentially a proponent of a radical aristocratic society. He wants to see the higher men achieve the greatest heights. He's not concerned about happiness in the greatest number, the general welfare, democracy. Nope, he's not about that. For the reasons that I already discussed earlier in this video, he wants to see the elevation of man, of the higher men, and he points out, which I think is, he makes a historical claim essentially, that all great societies originated from these kind of barbaric origins. That the nobility in culture was always originally barbaric. He talks about this again on the Genealogy of Morals, that the original conception of morality, of good versus bad rather than good versus evil, came from the nobility, came from these kind of barbaric origins where the strong, the noble, the powerful, the assertive or aggressive, they kind of deemed their own actions as good, and then everything kind of followed from there. Tying this back to the text, though, on page 192, quote, "The noble caste was in the beginning always the barbarian caste. Their superiority lay not in their physical strength, but primarily in their physical. They were more complete human beings." So he's kind of falling back on this idea that because all cultures were instinctively ordered and controlled, and naturally ordered and controlled by these barbarian, higher, stronger classes of men, that this is how it should be. This is what's going to lead us to the greatest society, and that everything we've kind of done since then, trying to civilize and tame man, has only made him weaker and led to a worse society. So he says here on 193, "The essential thing in a good and healthy aristocracy is, however, that it does not feel itself to be a function, but as their meaning and supreme justification. That it therefore accepts with a good conscience the sacrifice of innumerable men for its sake, have to be suppressed and reduced imperfect men to slaves and instruments." So he really, again, tying it back to this order of rank. He is willing to sacrifice or to treat the lower classes as slaves, as instruments. Let's use a little bit more friendly terminology. He's willing to keep the working class, as a bunch of worker bees, as a bunch of factory workers, to live very simple, impoverished lives, so that the higher of society, the greatest men of society, think celebrities, artists, leaders, so that they can reach the greatest heights. So again, we might think, oh, like we wouldn't want that, we don't have that. We kind of do. If you really think about it, we have a shade or a version, a variation of it, where the working class in pretty much every Western country makes up the majority. And what are the majority doing? They're barely living above welfare. They're kind of barely getting by, paycheck to paycheck. And what does that enable? Well, because the working class, the majority, are kept down here, well, the higher class are able to reach higher heights. They're able to create higher culture. Put a pin in that for a second. I'll come back to that point in a moment. But literally in like the next sentence, he says on page 193, Quote, its fundamental faith must be that society should not exist for the sake of society, but only as foundation and scaffolding upon which a select species of being is able to raise itself to its higher task and in general to a higher existence, like those sun-seeking climbing plants of Java. So what he's talking about here is these plants in the Amazon, I believe, is where it's from, or the rainforest, where essentially sunlight is tough real estate, right? It's hard to come through, or sunlight's hard to come by, and obviously you need sunlight as a plant for growth and to preserve yourself. So how does this plant do this? Well, it finds the tall trees, and this vine wraps around them and reaches to the top and basically leverages these tall trees as scaffolding. So think about it this way. Nietzsche is essentially saying that, hey, we'll sacrifice the majority, we'll sacrifice these working class, we'll sacrifice much of society and use them as essentially a pedestal for the higher men to stand upon so that they can reach the greatest height, so that the species itself can reach the greatest heights. A select species is able to, raise itself to its higher task and a higher existence. And again, his gripe with democracy, he explains more in section 242. And so on page 173, I'll quote here, he says, the democratization of Europe will lead to the production of a type prepared for slavery in the subtlest sense. An individual, in exceptional cases, the strong man will be found to turn out stronger and richer than has perhaps ever happened before. So he kind of argues that even though we think democracy creates this sense of equality, it's actually just enables more tyranny and more slavery because it treats everyone as equal. It kind of keeps them at the same spot. It creates this mediocre man. It creates this kind of herd instinct amongst men. And even in democracy, though, the higher men, the truly special, are still going to rise. And they'll actually rise even stronger in a democracy, and that'll lead to tyranny. So to kind of round out this idea is that Nietzsche believes that this will to power is driving these higher men, and they are the stronger will. They're capable of greatness, and he is willing to sacrifice society, potentially including himself, so that these greatest writers, these greatest artists, these greatest commanders, these greatest individuals of the human species can reach the greatest heights. We can reach this Ubermensch, and that if we choose to try to keep everyone at the same level, treat everyone as equal, give them all the same exact opportunity, kind of crush everyone down to a mean or an average, we are diminishing man. We're limiting our species from its potential. Now again, last note to round this out is try to not give Nietzsche the benefit of the doubt. Try and not look at everything so negatively. I don't personally agree with all of these thoughts. I do not. But one, it's important to listen and read to ideas you disagree with, critique them, find parts of value where you understand them, understand different perspectives. And two, it's also important to notice some of these, how it's reflected in society. So I talked about this a few moments ago. I think I can expand a little bit further here. Is Nietzsche believes that the best way to create high culture, and that means art, the greatest plays, the greatest music, we have to basically sacrifice certain people within society. Because to create the greatest art, you need free time, you need leisure. Let's just say Beethoven, right? Or she's hot right now, Taylor Swift, right? If Taylor Swift had to work a 9 to 5, she wouldn't have time to make the greatest music, or Rihanna or Frank Sinatra, whoever you want to choose historically. They would not be able to make the greatest music that we all love and cherish today if they had to work the job of a factory worker. So we have to sacrifice some people in society to reach that higher culture, to give them free time, to give them leisure and opportunity to create the great stuff. But we only give that to the people that are capable of doing that. If you aren't capable of creating great art, then you're not going to, be worthy of that time to see that come to fruition. So that's something, again, to think about where Nietzsche's coming from, his perspective. He wants culture. He's very concerned with Germanic culture. He's very concerned with how do we kind of achieve that Hellenistic period of Greek culture where they had leisure and they were able to make these amazing sculptures and ideas and doing all this. You can't really do that if you're working 9 to 5. So that's an important thing to think about. And the last note again on this is, as much as we think this is very distant from ourselves, it is very true to today. the working class is constantly working. It is submerged. A lot of people are turned into this herd animal where we believe what we're told, we do everything what we're, quote unquote supposed to do, we're following each other, we look up to celebrities and just take whatever opinion they have and worship them. And these celebrities are able to ascend. They're able to ascend even higher because we keep spending money on tickets, we keep buying their art, we keep listening to these politicians and doing all of this. So as much as we think that, oh, this is nothing like, reality, there are shades or connections that you can draw and see a little bit of what Nietzsche's talking about of tyrannical power, and how the sacrifice of the many does lead to some greater culture and music and art. The question is it worth it? And again, where in the order of rank are you will definitely change your perspective. And if you think it is good, truthful, useful, all of that. I think that's the best way to round it off, try and tie it all together. Overall, this book, man, second reading, I got at least 60% more understood. And I know I'm going to have to read it third, fourth, fifth time in the future, and I'll get even more juice out of my squeeze of this book. So highly recommend everyone read this book. If I could recommend any of Nietzsche's books within the series, it might be this one, although it's hard to understand. But what an incredible work. What one of my favorite books on the shelf. Challenges a lot of our prejudices and our beliefs that we hold to just be obvious. They're not quite as obvious or certain as we thought they were. So anyway, with all that said, I want to hear your thoughts down below. What section stood out to you? I know I didn't cover the maxims and interludes. There are a few that stood out to me, but I didn't think they really fit within this these concepts more broadly. So let me know. What concepts stood out to you? What arguments do you think Nietzsche made that are pretty accurate, pretty useful? There's a lot of logic to it. And where do you think he got it wrong? Let me know in the comments below. That's the whole aim of this series. And next week, we cap off this month with Thus Spoke Zarathustra. We're not reading the whole book for reference, because I've seen some comments like, how is he reading so fast? One, I got a little bit of a head start, and two, at least with this work, I'm not reading the whole thing. There's about like 8 or 10 sections we'll cover, so keep an eye out, and we'll discuss this book next week. With all that said, thank you guys so much for watching. I'm having a lot of fun with the series. I'm enjoying hearing the feedback, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Subscribe for more content like this, like the video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.